Send the money now, 12,000, or we're done here. The voice on the phone was sharp, impatient, and completely out of place in the quiet darkness of the room. Margaret Wilson lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan above her. The clock on her nightstand read 1:40 a.m. Its red numbers glowed softly, the only light in the small bedroom of her Oregon townhome. Outside, the street was silent. No cars, no wind. Just the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen down the hall. At 68, Margaret no longer slept deeply. Years of routine had trained her body to wake at the slightest disturbance. But this was different. This was not the gentle restlessness of age. This was intrusion. Her phone vibrated again on the wooden nightstand. Not a missed call, still ringing. She reached for it slowly, already knowing who it was. Her son never called this late unless something had gone wrong. "Mom," Eric said the moment she answered. No greeting, no apology for the hour. "Your card got declined. I need you to send $12,000 right now." Margaret sat up, pulling the thin quilt around her shoulders. The air felt colder than it had a moment ago. "Eric," she said quietly, her voice dry from sleep. "It's the middle of the night." "I know what time it is," he snapped. "That's not the point. The point is the card isn't working, and security is standing outside our door." The word security echoed in her chest. She pictured her son as she always did when he was upset, jaw tight, shoulders tense, pacing back and forth. But the background noise on the call didn't match that image. There was no echo of a hallway, no muffled panic. Instead, she heard the soft lap of water, faint music, glass clinking. "Where are you?" she asked. "Maui," Eric said, as if the answer explained everything. "The resort, the one I told you about." Margaret closed her eyes. She remembered the brochure he had sent months earlier. White sand, private villas, phrases like exclusive and uninterrupted luxury, printed in thick, confident lettering. "You said this trip was paid for," she said. "It was," he replied quickly. "Until the system messed up, they froze the room because your card didn't go through." "Your card." Margaret pressed her thumb into the edge of the phone. The plastic felt warm from her grip. "How much did you say?" 12,000, Eric repeated. "Just send it. We'll sort it out later." Later. The word had followed her for years. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. The room smelled faintly of lavender cleaner. Everything in the house was like that, clean, quiet, controlled. A life carefully arranged to take up as little space as possible. "Why $12,000? She asked. There was a pause. Not long, just enough. "It's the balance for the suite," he said, "and some services." "What services?" Another pause. "Look, Mom, this isn't the time to ask questions," Eric said, irritation bleeding into his voice. "We have staff knocking. This is embarrassing." Embarrassing. Margaret stood and walked toward the window. She pulled back the curtain slightly. The porch light across the street glowed over an empty driveway. Somewhere, a sprinkler clicked on and off. "Who's with you?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Brenda," Eric said. Then, louder, away from the phone. "She's asking again." A woman's voice drifted into the call, light and amused. "Is that your mom?" Brenda asked. "Tell her to hurry up." Margaret felt something tighten behind her ribs. Brenda's voice came closer, clearer now. "Mrs. Wilson," she said, not waiting to be introduced. "This is really uncomfortable. The staff is literally right outside." Margaret said nothing. Brenda continued, her tone shifting into something almost playful. "You live alone, right? It's not like you need the money tonight." The words landed slowly, one after another. Margaret's reflection stared back at her in the dark glass, her hair pulled back into a loose knot. Her face lined, familiar, tired. A woman who had spent decades lowering her own needs until they barely registered. "Brenda," Eric said, strained. "Just let me handle it." But Brenda didn't stop. "You can send it through the app," she said. 12,000 isn't that much, considering everything you don't spend on. Margaret's hand began to tremble. Not violently, just enough for her to notice. She thought of the library where she had worked for 40 years, the long wooden desks, the smell of old paper, the way she used to bring lunch in a brown bag, even after she could afford better. She thought of the check she had written for Eric's first college semester, then the next, and the one after that. "Mom," Eric said sharply, "are you sending it or not?" The question was not framed as a choice. Margaret inhaled slowly. The air filled her chest, then slipped out again. In that breath, she felt something shift, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but irreversible. She did not argue, she did not explain. She lowered the phone from her ear. "Mom?" Eric's voice cracked through the speaker. "Mom, don't do this." Margaret looked at the screen for a long moment. The name Eric glowed above the call timer. Then she pressed the button. The room fell silent. She stood there, phone in hand, listening to the quiet she had just created. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something closer to disbelief. She placed the phone face down on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, slid back under the quilt. For the first time in years, Margaret Wilson did not stay awake trying to fix someone else's crisis. She closed her eyes. Sleep did not come immediately, but the phone did not ring again. And for now, that was enough. If you hang up again, don't bother pretending you care about family. The call had ended, yet Margaret's ears still rang as if the sound were trapped inside her head. She lay on her back, eyes open, watching the ceiling fan rotate in slow circles. Then the phone buzzed again. Once, twice, 3 times in a row. Eric flashed across the screen like a warning. Margaret stared at it, hoping the buzzing would stop. It didn't. She answered without speaking. Finally, Eric said, "No greeting, just heat." "What are you doing?" Margaret sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. "It's 2 a.m, she said. "That's your answer?" Eric snapped. "Not, are you okay? Just time." "You're the one calling," she said. "Tell me what you need." Eric laughed, sharp and humorless. "I need you to fix what you broke." "What I broke," she repeated, letting the words hang. He exhaled hard. "They're outside the door," he said. "They want payment confirmation. I told them you'd send it." Margaret heard movement on his end. Smooth floors, distant voices, practiced politeness. This was not a motel argument. This was a place built to make people feel small. "You're making us look ridiculous," Eric said. Before Margaret could answer, Brenda's voice slid in, bright and close. "Mrs. Wilson," Brenda said, like she was stepping into a conversation she owned. "Hi, we're still here." Margaret didn't reply. Brenda continued anyway. "This isn't a little mix-up. This is a luxury property. They don't mess around." "You called me," Margaret said, "at 2 a.m. "We didn't call because we wanted to," Brenda said. "We called because we had to." Eric cut in. "Mom, stop. Just send it." Margaret kept her voice even. "Why is the amount 12,000? Brenda answered instantly. "Because that's what it costs. The suite, the dining, the private driver, the beach service, normal vacation things. Normal." Margaret felt her face heat. "Normal for who?" Brenda laughed. "For people who don't live like they're still saving for the Great Depression." Eric muttered, "Brenda," but it was weak. Brenda pressed harder. "I'm going to be honest. This whole 'I'm just a little old widow' act? It's tired. You have money. Eric told me you have savings. The house is paid off. And you're acting like we're asking you to donate an organ." Margaret's mouth went dry. She had never shared her finances with Brenda, not because it was secret, but because it was private. "Don't speak to me like that," Margaret said, low, controlled. Brenda didn't flinch. "Then don't put us in this position," she replied. "Right now, you're choosing to embarrass your son in front of everyone." "Everyone," Margaret repeated. "Staff, guests, people who actually matter here." That phrase landed like cold water. She had lived like this for years. Quiet clocks, careful bills, small routines that kept grief from spilling over. She balanced her checkbook the way other people said prayers. Not because she loved numbers, but because numbers were the one thing that didn't suddenly change its face and demand more. And yet Eric was speaking as if her restraint existed only to fund his excess. Eric's voice came back, softer but sharper. "If we get removed, it goes on our record. It affects my job. It affects everything. Are you really going to do that to me?" Margaret listened as if consequences were something she held over him, not something he had created. "Eric," she said, "you're 42. A pause. Then, "Don't lecture me." Brenda cut in, impatient. "It's simple. Send it, or we'll handle it another way." "What way?" Margaret asked. Brenda's answer was immediate. "We'll call the bank. We'll tell them you're refusing to help your family. We'll tell them you're confused. At your age, people would believe it." Margaret felt her stomach drop. It wasn't just greed, it was strategy. "I'm not confused," Margaret said. "I'm listening." Brenda sighed, annoyed. "This is what family does. You don't get to opt out when it's inconvenient." Margaret looked at the clock. 2:07 a.m. How many times had she been told she didn't get to opt out? How many times had family been used like a lock on the door? "How long have you been waiting to talk to me like this?" Margaret asked. A tiny silence, just long enough to admit the truth. Then Brenda returned, colder. "I'm talking to you like an adult. If you want to be treated gently, act gently. Send the money." Margaret's spine stiffened, not from anger, something steadier than that, a quiet refusal to be spoken over in her own life. Something inside her tightened and then, cleanly, released. "No," she said. Eric's voice rose. "What did you say?" "No," Margaret repeated clearer. Brenda laughed once, sharp with offense. "Wow, so you're really doing this?" Margaret didn't argue. She pressed the button. The line went dead. She waited for guilt to rush in the way it always had. Her pulse slowed. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer fear of losing them. It was fear of losing herself again if she gave in. Instead, she felt quiet. Margaret placed the phone face down, turned onto her side, and stared into the dark. She was not their emergency contact. She was not their credit line. Not tonight. "You've always been so good at helping. We'd never survive without you." The words did not come from the phone. They came from memory. Margaret Wilson sat at the small kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet again. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound sharp in the stillness. She had made a cup of tea but forgotten to drink it. A thin skin had already formed across the surface. Her hands rested flat on the table, palms down, as if she needed the pressure to remind herself that she was still here. Sleep would not come now. Not after what had been said. Not after what had been threatened. Instead, her mind moved backward, the way it always did when she tried to understand how she had arrived at a place she never meant to go. It started years ago, after Eric's first semester of college. He had called then, too, not in the middle of the night, but late enough. His voice had carried the careful tension of someone rehearsing disappointment. Tuition had gone up. A fee had been miscalculated. He needed help. Just this once. Margaret remembered standing in the library's staff room with the phone pressed to her ear, staring at the bulletin board covered in notices about book sales and volunteer shifts. She had said yes before he finished explaining. The check went out the next morning. After that, the requests came in waves. There was the internship that didn't pay enough, the apartment deposit that had to be secured quickly, the credit card balance that was supposed to be temporary. Each time, Eric promised it was the last time. Each time, Margaret believed him. She told herself it was what parents did. She told herself she was lucky to be able to help. When Eric met Brenda, the numbers changed. The first time Margaret heard Brenda's name, it was followed by a list of plans, trips, a move, a lifestyle that required momentum and money. The wedding came quickly and expensively. Margaret had written a check larger than any she had written in her life. She remembered how her hand shook as she signed it, not from doubt, but from fear of appearing unwilling. She attended the ceremony in a borrowed dress and sat among people she did not know, listening to speeches about ambition and success. No one mentioned sacrifice. No one mentioned restraint. After the wedding, the requests became smoother, less apology, more assumption. There was a business venture that failed within a year. Margaret paid off the remaining debt quietly. There was a car lease that could not be broken without penalty. She covered the penalty. She never asked for receipts. She never asked to see contracts. She did not want to know details that might make it harder to say yes. At home, her own life grew smaller. She delayed replacing the aging water heater. She ignored the ache in her hip. She learned to cook cheaper meals, to stretch groceries, to pretend she preferred simplicity over comfort. When Eric and Brenda posted photos online, Margaret recognized the restaurants before she recognized the places. White tablecloths, oversized plates, Brenda smiling into the camera with a bag on her arm that cost more than Margaret's monthly expenses. The captions were always the same, words like earned and grateful and hard work. Margaret never commented. Then came the private school tuition for Lily. Margaret had hesitated then, just briefly. The amount was large, the explanation thin. Eric had said it was an investment. Brenda had said it was about standards. Margaret wrote the check. She told herself it was for her granddaughter, not for them. Sitting at the table now, Margaret let herself add the numbers for the first time. Not precisely, but enough. College, wedding, debt, travel, tuition. The total made her breath catch. It was more than she had ever spent on herself, more than she had saved for emergencies, more than she had planned to leave behind. And yet, it had never felt like giving. It had felt like maintenance, like holding something together that would fall apart without her. Margaret stared at her hands. They looked older than she remembered. Veins raised, skin thin. Hands that had stamped library cards, shelved books, wiped down desks at closing time. Hands that had signed check after check. She realized then that what frightened her most was not the money she had lost, but the years she had spent believing that love was measured by how quietly she erased herself. The phone remained face down on the table. It did not ring. Margaret wrapped her fingers around the cold mug and lifted it slowly. The tea tasted bitter, oversteeped. She swallowed anyway. For the first time, she allowed herself to think a thought she had avoided for years. Helping was never supposed to cost her her life. The clock ticked on. Outside, the sky began to lighten, just slightly. And somewhere in that slow approach of morning, Margaret felt the weight of obligation begin to loosen. Not disappear, just loosen enough for her to breathe. If you don't send it, you're the reason we get dragged out of here. Margaret did not sleep. By the time the sky began to pale at the edges, she had moved through the house in small, quiet steps, turning lights on and off as if the switches could reset her thoughts. She rinsed the mug from the kitchen table. She folded a dish towel that did not need folding. She stood at the sink and watched the faucet drip once, then again, counting the seconds between drops. Her townhome had always been the kind of place where nothing dramatic happened. 2 bedrooms, a narrow staircase, a small porch with a single potted plant that survived mostly on stubbornness. She kept the floors clean. She kept the mail sorted. She kept her life in order. But now the air felt different. Not because of what Eric and Brenda had done, because of what Margaret had not done. She had ended the call. She had said no. The fact sat in her body like a new object, unfamiliar in weight and shape. She expected it to hurt more. She expected guilt to arrive in a sharp wave the way it always had. Instead, there was a strange quiet. Not peace, not relief, just quiet. At 6:12 a.m., her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. A message from Eric. A short line, no greeting. Answer. Now. Margaret did not respond. Another buzz. You're doing this on purpose. She set the phone down on the counter and made toast. The bread popped up with a soft click that felt too normal for the morning she was in. She ate standing up, chewing slowly, tasting almost nothing. As she moved through her routine, she noticed small things she normally ignored. The way her hands shook when she reached for the kettle. The way her shoulders stayed lifted as if she was bracing for impact. The way her mind kept searching for the right solution, the one that would calm everyone down. That instinct was old. Margaret had spent most of her adult life managing emotional weather. She had done it quietly, with polite smiles, with quick apologies, with checks written before arguments could begin. After her husband died, she had promised herself she would not fall apart. She would not cause problems. She would not make grief anyone else's burden. So she kept moving. And when Eric started leaning on her, she let him. It felt like purpose. It felt like staying useful. Now usefulness had turned into a trap. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. She watched it ring. She did not answer. The sound filled the kitchen like a smoke alarm, impossible to ignore. Her pulse rose. She felt the familiar urge to grab the phone, to fix this, before it became worse. But another thought surfaced beneath that urge. If I pick up, the conversation starts again at the same place. Not at love, not at concern, at payment, at obedience. She let the call go to voicemail. When the ringing stopped, her body did not relax. It stayed tense, as if expecting punishment. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to the silence. The voicemail icon appeared. She did not open it. Instead, she stared at the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips and remembered the sound of Brenda's voice. Not the words, the tone, the way it had carried amusement while talking about humiliation, the way it had sounded confident while threatening to describe Margaret as confused. That was the part Margaret could not shake, because it meant this was not an argument between family members. It was leverage. It was a plan. At 7:05 a.m., another message arrived. They're saying they'll keep our passports. Margaret's throat tightened. She read it twice. Her first instinct was to panic, to imagine Eric trapped somewhere, harmed, powerless. Then she forced herself to slow down. A luxury resort was not a jail. Security standing outside a door was not a kidnapping. This was about money. This was always about money. She put the phone down again. She walked upstairs to the small spare room she used for storage. It had boxes of old holiday decorations, a folded card table, and 3 plastic bins labeled in black marker. Photos, tax, library. Margaret slid the tax bin out and pulled the lid off. She did not know why she was doing it at first. Maybe because paper made things real. Maybe because numbers were easier to face than voices. She sat on the floor and opened the bin. Receipts, statements, old checkbook stubs. She had kept them out of habit, not intention. As she flipped through the pile, she saw the same pattern again and again. Transfers, withdrawals, large checks written to cover emergencies that had never truly been emergencies. She found one receipt from years ago. The ink faded. It was for a wire transfer. The note line had her handwriting. Eric, urgent, urgent. Everything had always been urgent. Margaret leaned her head back against the wall. She thought about Eric as a child, how small his hand felt in hers on the first day of school, how he used to cling to her leg when he was afraid. She remembered telling herself that she would always be there for him. That promise had been made to a child, not to a grown man who could threaten her, not to an adult couple who could mock her life. Margaret closed her eyes. Her breathing was shallow. Then she inhaled deeply, forcing air into her lungs until her chest lifted. She opened her eyes and looked down at the papers again. For the first time, she let herself admit something she had resisted. If she sent the money now, it would not end. It would teach them the same lesson again. That pressure worked. That shame worked. That the loudest voice won. She slid the papers back into the bin. She put the lid on. She stood up slowly, knees stiff, and walked back downstairs. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was longer. You're ruining everything. They're going to escort us out. I can't believe you do this to your own son. If you ever cared about me, you'll send it. Don't make this worse. Margaret read it once. Then she read it again, slower. It was the same sentence, dressed up in different words. Pay, or you're guilty. She felt heat rise in her face, then drain away. A choice formed in her mind, clear and quiet. She would not argue. She would not explain. She would not defend herself to someone who had already decided she was wrong. Margaret turned the phone over, face down. She left it on the kitchen counter. Then she did something she had not done in years. She sat in the living room without turning on the television. No background noise, no distraction. Just the soft light coming in through the blinds and the sound of her own breathing. Her heart still felt unsteady, but underneath it, something steadier was beginning to form. Not anger, not revenge, a boundary. And for the first time, Margaret understood that silence could be a decision. Not weakness, not avoidance, a decision. She stayed there until the morning fully arrived, and she did not pick up the phone. Ma'am, your son and his wife are being detained in the main lobby. The call came at 9:18 a.m. Margaret was standing by the kitchen window, watching a delivery truck idle across the street, when her phone rang again. A different number this time. Not Eric, not Brenda. She answered slowly. The voice on the other end was calm, practiced, and unmistakably professional. The kind of voice trained to deliver unpleasant information without absorbing it. Mrs. Wilson, the man said, I'm calling regarding your son and his wife. They're currently at a resort property in Hawaii. Margaret did not speak. They attempted to check out this morning, he continued. However, there is an outstanding balance on the account. Because of the amount and the services involved, the property has involved legal staff and local authorities. Margaret felt her shoulders stiffen. Detained? She asked carefully. Not arrested, the man clarified, but they are not permitted to leave the premises until the balance is resolved. The words landed one by one. Main lobby. Outstanding balance. Not permitted. Margaret thanked him and ended the call. She did not sit down. She stood there, phone in hand, letting the reality settle into her body. This was no longer a private argument. This was public. Minutes later, another call came through. This one was from the resort's legal department. The woman who spoke introduced herself with a full name Margaret immediately forgot. Her tone was courteous, efficient, and distant. The total includes lodging, private services, dining, transportation, and premium amenities. She said, the amount exceeds what the property can carry without confirmation. Margaret listened, absorbing the list. Each item sounded like a separate door she had never opened. They are upset, the woman added, not unkindly. This situation is visible to other guests. Visible. Margaret pictured the lobby without ever having seen it. Polished floors, tall windows, guests waiting for shuttles, sipping coffee, glancing sideways. She imagined Eric standing there, shoulders tight, trying to explain himself. She imagined Brenda's posture, the chin lifted, the voice raised just enough to signal outrage. The woman paused. "If you authorize the transfer now, this can be resolved quickly." Margaret took a breath. "No," she said. There was a brief silence on the line. Not surprise, calculation. "I understand," the woman replied. "However, the consequences will continue." Margaret nodded even though the woman could not see her. "I understand." When the call ended, the house felt suddenly too quiet. At 9:41 a.m., Eric's name flashed on the screen again. She did not answer. At 9:43, a message arrived. "They're making a scene. Brenda's yelling. People are staring." Margaret read the message once. Then another arrived. "Security took our passports." Her breath caught. Just for a second. She forced herself to slow down, to separate fear from fact. A luxury resort did not seize passports lightly. This was procedure, temporary, conditional. It was not danger. It was consequence. At 10:02 a.m., the phone rang again, this time a new number. "Mrs. Wilson," a man said. His voice was firmer than the others. "I'm with local law enforcement. We're assisting the property with an unresolved financial matter involving your son." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. "If you're able to transfer the funds," he continued, "we can conclude this immediately." Margaret looked at the grain of the table beneath her fingertips. She thought of the receipts upstairs, the bins, the word urgent written in her own hand. "They are adults," she said. Her voice did not shake. "This is not my responsibility." There was a pause. "I need to confirm," the officer said carefully. "You're refusing to assist?" Margaret swallowed. "I am declining to pay." Another pause, longer this time. "Understood," the officer said. "We'll proceed accordingly." The line went dead. Margaret remained seated, hands folded in front of her. She did not feel victorious. She felt exposed. At 10:27 a.m., messages began to arrive rapidly. "You did this. They revoked our VIP access. They won't let us use the shuttle. They took us to a side room." Margaret did not respond. She pictured the side room, smaller, neutral, away from the windows. She imagined Brenda's voice echoing too loudly, drawing attention she could not control. She imagined Eric realizing, finally, that no one was coming to fix this. At 11:10 a.m., the messages stopped. Margaret stood and walked to the sink. She washed her hands slowly, carefully, as if resetting her body. When she looked up, her reflection startled her. She looked older, but she also looked awake. For the first time, the humiliation was not hers. It was theirs. And the weight of that truth settled into the room, quiet and irreversible. "If you send the money, everything ends here." The sentence followed Margaret long after the call had ended. It stayed with her as she moved through the house, as she rinsed a plate that was already clean, as she straightened a stack of mail she had already sorted. The words had been delivered calmly, reasonably, as if they were an act of kindness. "If you send the money, everything ends here." Margaret knew better. She sat in the living room, hands folded in her lap, and let the thought settle. The curtains were half open. Sunlight stretched across the carpet in pale rectangles. It was nearly noon now, the day moving forward without waiting for her to catch up. She had spent her life believing that endings came from harsh decisions. But this situation was teaching her something else. Endings often came from compliance. The phone rang again. She did not rush to answer. She waited until the fourth ring, long enough to steady her breathing. The voice on the line was not the officer from earlier, nor the legal representative. This man spoke more slowly, his tone measured. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, I want to be clear. This is not about blame. This is about resolution. Margaret listened. Your son and his wife are under significant stress. A financial transfer would allow them to leave immediately. Margaret closed her eyes. She pictured Eric as he had been the night before. The impatience, the certainty that she would step in, as she always had. And if I don't, she asked. The man hesitated. Then the property will proceed with standard measures, documentation, credit reporting, travel delays. There it was, not danger. Consequence. Margaret's fingers tightened together. For years, she said slowly, I believed that my job was to prevent discomfort. The man did not interrupt. I thought that if I acted quickly enough, quietly enough, nothing would escalate. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, but every time I paid, the problem returned, larger. Silence. She continued. If I send the money now, it doesn't end. It confirms. The man exhaled softly. I understand your position. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the room around her. The framed photos, her husband's old chair by the window, a life that had always belonged to her, even when she forgot it. I am not sending the money, she said. The words landed cleanly. No apology, no anger. Understood, the man replied. I'll note your decision. The call ended. Margaret remained seated, listening to the silence that followed. It felt heavier than before, but also clearer. She stood and walked to the desk in the corner of the room. On it sat a folder she rarely opened. Inside were copies of bank statements, authorization forms, and old correspondence. She opened the folder and scanned the pages. Her name appeared again and again under sections labeled Primary Holder and Authorized User. She had granted access out of trust, out of habit, out of fear of being seen as withholding. The realization was sharp. Control had never been taken from her. She had handed it over. Margaret reached for the phone and dialed her bank. She waited through the automated menu without irritation, as if patience had returned to her body. When the representative came on the line, Margaret spoke clearly. I'd like to revoke all secondary access on my accounts, she said, effective immediately. There was a pause while the request was processed. Yes, the representative confirmed. All cards associated with your account will be deactivated. Margaret felt a brief tightening in her chest, then release. And I'd like to stop the monthly transfers, she added. All of them. The representative did not question her. Done, she said. Margaret thanked her and ended the call. She set the phone down and sat back in the chair. Her hands were trembling now. Not from fear, but from the aftershock of choosing herself. She expected grief to follow, or doubt. Instead, what arrived was something quieter. Clarity. The line had been drawn, not in anger, not in revenge, but in recognition. Margaret leaned her head back and closed her eyes. For the first time, the consequences were no longer hers to manage. Why is nothing working anymore? The question did not come to Margaret directly. It arrived through silence, the kind of silence that follows a decisive action, the kind that feels unnatural at first, like the moment after a door closes and the house briefly holds its breath. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she had reheated twice. Outside, the afternoon light had shifted. Shadows moved slowly across the floor, marking time without urgency. Her phone lay on the counter, face up. For hours, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no demands. She told herself not to read into it. She knew better than that. At 2:14 p.m., the first message arrived. Did you change something? Margaret read it once. She did not respond. At 2:18, another message. My card isn't going through. I'm on hold with the bank. She closed her eyes briefly. This was the moment she had always avoided. The moment when consequences reached the people who expected her to absorb them. The phone buzzed again. "What did you do?" Margaret exhaled slowly and stood up. She carried her mug to the sink and rinsed it out. The water ran hot over the ceramic. Steam rose, then vanished. She dried her hands and returned to the table. The messages continued. They shut everything off. "This is insane. Fix it." Margaret felt the old reflex flare inside her, the urge to smooth, to explain, to reassure. She did not act on it. She sat still and allowed the discomfort to exist. At 2:31 p.m., the tone changed. "Are you mad at us?" The words pulled at something softer, something practiced. Margaret stared at the screen, remembering how often she had been asked that question over the years. It had always been a shortcut, a way to reframe pressure as hurt feelings. She did not answer. At 2:39, another message. "Brenda can't get into the rental car. They're saying the payment failed." Margaret felt her stomach tighten, then settle. This was not about a car. It was about access. At 3:02 p.m., the phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. Eric's voice came through immediately, loud and strained. "Everything's locked," he said. "Cards, accounts, transfers. I don't know what you told them, but you need to undo it." Margaret listened without interrupting. "You can't just shut us off," he continued. "That's not fair." Fair. She waited until he stopped talking. "I didn't shut you off," she said. "I ended my involvement." There was a pause. "You're punishing us," Eric said. "No," Margaret replied. "I'm stepping back." "That's the same thing," he snapped. Margaret did not raise her voice. "It isn't." She could hear movement on his end. Doors opening and closing. A voice in the background, Brenda's, sharp and frantic. "She can't hear you," Eric said suddenly. "She's dealing with the desk." Margaret closed her eyes. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "This is spiraling. Just turn it back on. We'll talk later." Later. Margaret recognized the word. She had lived under it for years. "There's nothing to turn back on," she said. "Those were temporary permissions." "Temporary?" Eric repeated. "You've been helping us for years." "Yes," Margaret said. "And now I'm not." Silence stretched between them. "This is going to ruin us," Eric said finally. Margaret looked at the window, at the quiet street beyond it. The world was not ending. It was continuing. "I didn't create your life," she said. "I supported it." "That's the same thing," he said again. "No," Margaret replied. "It isn't." Her voice surprised her. It was steady, unmoved. "Mom," Eric said, softer now. "Please." Margaret felt the word land where it always had, in the place that still remembered small hands and scraped knees. But she also felt something else, resolve. "I love you," she said, "but I'm not doing this anymore." She ended the call. The silence returned. This time it felt different, not empty, complete. Margaret remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The flow had been cut. And for the first time, she understood that the panic on the other end of the line was not her responsibility to soothe. "Your account no longer qualifies." Margaret heard the phrase for the first time not from her son, but from a message forwarded without comment. It arrived late in the afternoon, a screenshot of an automated notification. No greeting, no explanation, just proof. She studied the image carefully. The clean lines, the neutral language there, words, designed to sound temporary but mean something else entirely, no longer qualifies. Margaret set the phone down and leaned back in her chair. The house around her remained unchanged. The clock ticked. A bird tapped once against the window before flying away. She waited for something to happen inside her. Nothing did. That night, the updates came in fragments, not demands, not accusations, information, At 7:42 p.m., a message. The lease company came at 7:59. They're taking the SUV tomorrow. At 8:13, they won't renew the rental. Margaret read each message once and set the phone back down. She did not respond. She did not ask questions. She had learned what questions did. The next morning, the collapse became visible. Eric called early. His voice sounded different, less sharp, less certain. "The bank flagged everything," he said. "My credit's wrecked." Margaret listened. "I can't use my corporate card anymore," he continued. "They pulled me off the overseas project." She closed her eyes. "That's not your fault," he added quickly. "I know that." She waited. "But if you hadn't—" She opened her eyes. "Eric," she said. "Stop." He stopped. The silence stretched. She imagined him standing somewhere unfamiliar, surrounded by the remains of a life that no longer made sense. At noon, another message arrived. This one longer. Written in haste. They posted a notice on the door. "We have 30 days. Margaret read it twice. 30 days. She thought of the years she had given, quietly, without notice. The difference was not lost on her. In the afternoon, she opened her laptop for the first time in days. She logged into her email and scrolled past messages she had ignored, promotions, newsletters, a notice from her bank confirming the changes she had requested. Everything was exactly as she had asked. That evening, she went for a walk around the block. The air smelled of cut grass and rain. Neighbors waved. A dog barked from behind a fence. The world had not shifted. Back inside, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was not Eric. It was Brenda. A long message. No greeting, no restraint. "You destroyed us." Margaret stared at the words. More messages followed. "You always hated me. You waited for this. I hope you're happy." Margaret felt the old instinct rise, the urge to defend herself, to explain that this had not been planned. She let the instinct pass. She turned the phone off. That night, as she lay in bed, Margaret realized something that startled her. For the first time, she was not monitoring another adult's life. She was not waiting for the next crisis. The collapse was happening elsewhere, and she was not inside it. "She ruined us. Tell everyone what she did." The sentence arrived secondhand. Margaret did not hear it spoken. She read it later, paraphrased by someone who felt the need to explain why messages had stopped coming, why invitations had quietly disappeared, why the tone around Eric and Brenda had shifted. It was said loudly, she was told, repeated often, as if volume could replace evidence. In the days that followed, Brenda tried to control the story. She called relatives. She sent long messages to friends. She posted carefully worded complaints online, vague enough to avoid names, but sharp enough to imply cruelty. The phrases were familiar. Abandoned. Betrayed. After everything we did for her. Margaret saw none of it directly. She heard about it through absence. Eric's calls stopped first. Then the messages thinned out. When they came, they were shorter, less certain. Requests had turned into statements, statements into silence. Margaret noticed the change the way one notices a storm moving away. Not because the sky clears immediately, but because the pressure lifts. One afternoon, she received a call from a distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in years. The woman sounded uncomfortable, apologetic. "I just wanted to check on you," she said. "There were stories." Margaret listened. "They said you cut them off without warning," the cousin continued. "That you knew what would happen." Margaret did not rush to defend herself. She asked one question. "What did they say I owed them?" There was a pause. "I'm not sure," the cousin admitted. Margaret thanked her and ended the call. That was how it went. Plenty of accusation, very little detail. Brenda's anger burned hot at first. Messages arrived in clusters, sent late at night, then deleted. Screenshots were forwarded to Margaret by people who did not know what to do with them. The language grew harsher as the audience shrank. You think you're better than us. You always look down on me. You planned this. Margaret read none of it directly. She did not need to. She understood rage well enough to recognize when it had nowhere left to go. As the days passed, something else became clear. People were not rallying. The friends who had admired Brenda's lifestyle grew quiet. The family members who had once praised Eric's success stopped returning calls. Invitations went unanswered. Messages were left unread. The story Brenda wanted to tell required a villain who could be believed. And Margaret did not fit the role. She was not loud. She was not cruel. She had no history of threats or manipulation. No trail of chaos behind her. Just decades of consistency. Rage, Margaret realized, could only survive if someone absorbed it. And she was no longer absorbing anything. One evening, as she watered the plant on her porch, her neighbor paused at the bottom of the steps. I heard things got messy with your son, the woman said gently. Margaret nodded. They did. I'm sorry, the neighbor said. That's hard. Margaret felt the words settle without resistance. Yes, she replied. It was. No explanation followed, no justification. The neighbor squeezed her arm once and walked away. Inside, Margaret set the watering can down and stood still for a moment. The house felt quieter than it ever had. Not empty, uncluttered. The isolation was not hers. It belonged to the people still shouting into rooms that no longer listened. That night, Margaret slept deeply for the first time in weeks. And when she woke, there were no new messages waiting. Only morning. Grandma, I didn't know. The call came in the early evening, just as the light outside began to soften. Margaret had been sitting at the small dining table, sorting through a stack of old mail she had kept out of habit rather than need. Most of it was unnecessary now. Flyers, renewal notices. Things she had once felt responsible for tracking. Her phone vibrated once. The name on the screen made her pause. Lily. Margaret felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She answered without hesitation. Lily's voice was quiet, careful, as if she were stepping onto uncertain ground. Hi, Grandma, she said. Margaret closed her eyes. She could picture her granddaughter exactly. Shoulders slightly hunched, fingers whirring the edge of her sleeve the way she always did when she was nervous. I'm here, Margaret said. There was a long silence. I didn't know, Lily said again. About the money, about everything. Margaret did not interrupt. My parents told me stories, Lily continued. They said things were complicated, that you changed, that you stopped caring. Margaret listened, her breathing steady. I believed them, Lily said. I didn't question it. I should have. The admission hung between them. I started looking at things, Lily went on. Old emails, bank notices, stuff Mom forgot to delete. I saw how much you sent, how long it went on. Margaret's throat tightened. I'm so sorry, Lily said. The words came out in a rush now. I thought I was living on my parents' money. I didn't know it was yours. Margaret felt her eyes sting. It's not your fault, she said softly. I feel like it is, Lily replied. I let them use you. Margaret shook her head, even though Lily could not see it. You didn't let anything happen, she said. You were a child. Lily was quiet for a moment. Mom's really angry, she said. She keeps saying you ruined everything, but people don't believe her. Not anymore. Margaret absorbed this in silence. I just wanted you to know, Lily continued, her voice steadier now, that I see it, and I'm not mad at you. Margaret felt something inside her shift. Not relief, not triumph. Permission. Thank you, she said. They stayed on the line without speaking for a few seconds. The silence was gentle. I don't know what's going to happen next, Lily said finally. That's okay, Margaret replied. You don't have to figure it out right now. Lily exhaled. I'm glad you picked up. So am I, Margaret said. When the call ended, Margaret remained seated, the phone resting lightly in her hand. She did not cry right away. The tears came later, quietly, as she stood at the kitchen sink and watched the water run over her hands. They were not tears of anger. They were tears of release. For the first time, someone had named the truth without being asked. Margaret turned off the tap and dried her hands slowly. She felt lighter than she had in years. Not because the past had been fixed, but because it had been seen. "I've never done anything just for me." The sentence surfaced while Margaret was standing in line at the travel agency, its fluorescent lights humming softly above her head. She had not planned to come. The idea had arrived quietly, without urgency or drama. A thought that felt unfamiliar precisely because it asked for nothing in return. She held her purse with both hands, the way she always did in public spaces, and waited as the woman ahead of her finished discussing dates and refunds. The brochure rack beside the counter was filled with places Margaret had only ever seen on calendars and postcards. When it was her turn, she stepped forward. "I'm looking for something quiet," she said. "Somewhere near water." The agent smiled and asked a few questions. Length of stay, budget, preferences. Margaret answered honestly. Later that afternoon, she sat at her kitchen table with the confirmation email open on her laptop. The destination was a small coastal town on Vancouver Island. No itinerary, no expectations, just space. She stared at the screen for a long moment before closing the laptop. The feeling that followed surprised her, not excitement, relief. In the days leading up to the trip, Margaret noticed how much of her life had been organized around waiting. Waiting for calls, waiting for needs, waiting for emergencies that justified her existence. Without that structure, her days felt oddly wide. She filled them slowly. She donated a box of books she had been saving for no reason. She canceled a magazine subscription she no longer read. She took longer walks and shorter naps. When the day of departure came, she packed lightly. One suitcase, comfortable shoes, a jacket she had owned for years but rarely worn. On the ferry to the island, Margaret stood at the rail and watched the water move beneath her. The air was cool and clean. She breathed deeply, as if testing whether she was allowed to. At the small inn where she stayed, she met a woman around her age during breakfast. They spoke politely at first, exchanging the kind of information people share without commitment. Later, over coffee, the conversation shifted. The woman talked about her children, about college tuition, about working extra years she hadn't planned to work. "I never did anything for myself," the woman said. "There was always something more urgent." Margaret listened. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she heard herself speak. "That wasn't love," she said quietly. "That was obligation." The words felt steady when they left her mouth. The woman looked at her, surprised, then thoughtful. Margaret realized then that she was not explaining her decision. She was naming it. That afternoon, Margaret walked along the shoreline alone. The beach was nearly empty. She removed her shoes and let the cold water touch her ankles. She thought about Eric, about Brenda, about Lily. She did not feel anger. She felt distance. And in that distance, she felt something else take shape. A sense of self that was not defined by response time or financial reach. That evening, she sat by the window of her room and watched the light fade over the water. For the first time, she did not check her phone. She did not wonder who might need her next. She was not on call. She was present. Margaret slept deeply that night, not because everything was resolved, but because she had finally chosen herself. "I'm not your safety net." The knock came in the late afternoon, months after the phone calls had stopped. Margaret was in the living room, reading by the window, when she heard it. Not sharp, not hesitant, controlled. The kind of knock meant to signal restraint. She set the book down and stood slowly. Her body felt different now, less tense, less prepared for impact. She walked to the door without rehearsing what she would say. When she opened it, Eric and Brenda stood on the porch. They looked smaller than she remembered, not physically, but in posture. Eric's shoulders sloped forward, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket as if unsure where they belonged. Brenda stood slightly behind him. Her hair was pulled back tightly. Her expression was careful, stripped of its old confidence. Margaret stepped aside, without a word. They entered the house quietly. The living room had not changed. The framed photos, the old chair, the faint smell of coffee that lingered even hours after the pot was emptied. They sat across from her at the dining table. The distance between them felt deliberate. Margaret brought out a folder and placed it on the table. Inside were receipts, bank statements, wire confirmations. 15 years of quiet support made visible. She did not slide them forward dramatically. She simply opened the folder and let it rest between them. Eric stared at the papers. His jaw tightened. Brenda's eyes flicked across the page, then away. Margaret spoke calmly. "I didn't call you here to argue," she said. "I called you so there would be no confusion." She turned one page. "I helped because I believed it was love," she continued. "But love doesn't require fear, and it doesn't survive threats." Eric opened his mouth, then closed it. Brenda shifted in her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was flat. "We were under pressure," she said. Margaret nodded once. "So was I." She closed the folder. "I am your mother," she said to Eric. "But I am not your insurance policy. I am not your emergency fund. And I am not your wife's account." The words did not shake. They did not need to. Silence settled over the table. Eric looked at her then, not with anger, with something closer to recognition. "We didn't know how far it had gone," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "You didn't need to know the total to understand the pattern." Brenda's fingers curled into her palm. "We're not asking for money," she said quickly. "We just—" Margaret lifted a hand, not to stop her, to slow her. "This is not a negotiation," she said. "It's an ending." She stood. "I hope you build a life you can afford," she added, "in every sense of the word." Eric stood as well. He hesitated, then nodded once. They left without another word. Margaret closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment. Not from exhaustion, from release. She returned to the table and gathered the papers, placing them back into the folder. The house was quiet again, not empty, finished. Margaret walked back to the window and picked up her book. Outside, the light was fading. She turned the page. The story had ended, and her life continued.